so much for coming at the Leaders Show at the Zali Foundation. We are very grateful to have you here. John, you have undoubtedly a very successful career. You are a pharmaceutical physician, an entrepreneur, a leader, and an author. How would you describe John in 3 words?
Hi, Datina. Thank you so much for the kind introduction. How would I describe myself in 3 words? Describe myself as, first of all, driven, caring, and spiritual.
You immigrated in the UK with your family when you were 8 years old. You immigrated from Cameroon. How was your life in Cameroon at that time? Can you share with us some of your childhood memories that you remember as a child?
That's correct. I moved with my family from Cameroon when I was 8 years old. So I remember a lot of Cameroon. I had a very privileged upbringing. I attended private school in Cameroon. My father was a businessman alongside his other work, and was very, he certainly encouraged us when we demonstrated an aptitude for intellectual activity, and he encouraged our academic pursuits. And it was certainly a home where being well read was encouraged. I'm not sure at that time it wasn't so much pushy, it was just the fact that the television was broken a lot of the time. We'd be on the plane and there'd be lots of things to read. I remember this Q&A leaflet type thing. So it's got the question on the front, the answers at the back. And I like to read, have facts about, what's the biggest museum in the world, and, what's the greatest, what's the longest river in Africa, all those kind of things. And I just remember being incredibly curious. So growing up I just remember just being intensely curious and having the avenues, being fortunate enough to have the avenues to pursue that curiosity, and also having parents who nurtured that. So I suppose in aggregate, it was a good childhood.
Did coming in the UK change your life? If so, how did it change your life? Did you encounter any challenges and how did you overcome those?
I suppose coming to the UK changed my life in the sense that it was a culture shock. A lot of what we had in the UK, we had in Cameroon anyway. So we had access to good education. We lived in the city, so we had access to obviously the basic amenities. And the fact of my parents' work meant that we also had access to perhaps more than other people may have had access to in Africa and in Europe. So in some ways, it was a culture shock in the sense that we were beginning life anew and having to acclimatize ourselves to a new way of living. So my experience here from an academic perspective wasn't much different. I grew up, at least the school I attended was based on the British curriculum. So transitioning to that in this country was fairly straightforward. There were challenges in the sense that obviously I had a Cameroonian accent. I believe at the time I was my cousins were there, but they are British born, and they had a British accent or an English accent. I was Cameroonian born, coming in with a very strong accent. So I do remember kids making comments, I suppose. I remember one child making a comment about my skin color being similar to mud or Snickers, and I was fortunate that I was in a school where the headmaster was really ahead of his time, really ahead of his time. He called us both in, he reprimanded this young chap, he tried to help me to understand that, I'm in a new country and some people just don't understand that I'm no different from them because I look different. He asked me if there was anything more that I wanted to do to have that situation addressed. He asked me how I felt. So he really attended. to my needs in that regard. It was, I'll name him actually because he was an incredible man, Mr. Morton of Putridge Junior School. He's now passed away, but he was a remarkable individual. So after that and then another incident, I never experienced that again. So junior school in England was such a wonderful time. I had a really wonderful time here. I remember just enjoying being part of the festive activities. I remember, there were songs about harvest time. I remember playing conkers. So there was a sense of acceptance. But I think at that age, unless children have been influenced by their parents to think about things negatively, they're generally quite positive. There is a curiosity there, but it's a curiosity that's pleasant. They're genuinely curious about where you're from because they want to know. They're not disparaging you, but they want to know more. So I have very fond memories. So did life change? Yes, it was disruptive. There was a cultural shock, and that's because I'd say in some ways our standard of living took maybe a step backwards, actually, which may sound strange, but life in Africa was very good. But there are reasons for the choices that were made because economically things weren't trending in the right direction.
You studied at one of the best universities of the world, Yale University in the USA. You studied about public health. How did Yale change you? Can you share with us a little bit more of your experience in the US while studying at the Yale University?
Yes, I completed a master's in public health at Yale. It was, and I've said this several times, it was the single most transformational experience in my adult life. I'm a doctor, as you know, and medicine is very much about playing detective, identifying underlying pathology and what's wrong with someone's health. So you're a detective, you find out what's wrong, and you come up with a plan to treat things. It's a very linear form of thinking. So yes, there's an aspect of creativity, but A leads to B leads to C leads to treatment, right? So when I was at Yale, I met people who weren't, I suppose, their thinking wasn't ossified in that direction. And so when we were debating, there was a lot of debate because I concentrated in health policy and management. So obviously there's a lot of discussions around politics, around philosophy, sometimes around jurisprudence, not only related to the United States, but globally as well. So engaging in discussions with students who had an agility of mind was initially incredibly challenging, incredibly frustrating, but that challenge forced me to expand my mode of thinking, my mode of cognition. I was forced to step out of a linear way of thinking and explore things from a more holistic or full spectrum, so 360-degree perspective. And that was transformational in itself because it made me realize that actually, perhaps the way I thought about the world, perhaps the way I analyzed, synthesized, and computed problems was one way of many. And when you become aware of the possibilities, even in your mode of cognition, that changes everything, because if your thinking can be different, then the possibilities of accomplishment, attainment, and resolution of problems can obviously be different, as in what you thought was impossible becomes possible. Yale taught me the importance of having integrity, the importance of nurturing relationships, and the crucial importance of living by a set of values that leads to benefit as many individuals of humankind as is possible. So I suppose also, I think it fundamentally changed me in that I was forced to reflect on who I was up until that time, and also on what I want to be and what I wish to leave behind. I understand that, I was at Yale School of Public Health, but from what I experienced, Yale itself is very much community focused, social enterprise driven. So if you look at the business school, so Yale School of Management, their curriculum, a lot of people who go to that end up either working for non-profits or being engaged in non-profit activities or social impact activities. So even they may go into the private company, corporate sector, they may work in the corporate sector, but along, and part of their work may involve working with healthcare institutions, health systems, social impact projects. So in that sense, I realized that I could leverage my contribution capital to achieve a greater impact than I had considered at that time. And that's how it transformed me, because it changed the way I not only changed the way I see the world, but it changed the goals that I set for myself.
Unfortunately, racism is a significant issue all over the world. And as a nation, as a society, we have a responsibility to do everything in our power to raise awareness about racism and to work towards eliminating racism in all settings, whether these are schools, workplace, public spaces. It is our duty, it's our responsibility to do so. According to you, John, what key measures can we take as a society, as a nation, to help eliminate racism?
Before answering that question, I feel it's important to be clear on why exactly racism is such an issue, because some people may think, well, racism exists, why is it an issue? So if we think about life events as having an impact on somebody's mind, on somebody's bandwidth, okay? So everyone has a certain unit of energy that they have on any given day. So work stress will cause a certain impact, so take away your energy in that sense. Just the act of working, a job, will take away a certain amount of energy. So think about energy as a bank account, okay? So £1,000 in your energetic bank account. And the various events in your life will extract a certain amount on any given day. Some variables, some factors will extract more, okay? And some people will say, well, racism is only one aspect, one event. But actually, some factors can be so significant that their impact on your life energy and on your psychology and on your mind and sense of well-being is much greater. So the impact of one factor may have one factor may have the impact of 3 factors combined. So these factors aren't equally weighted, okay? So now, looking at this model, having considered this, I think we can now be in a position to more accurately answer the question, why is racism an issue? Racism is an issue because the impact of it on an individual can sometimes overwhelm someone's, psychological resources. The impact of racism is sometimes greater the impact of other factors combined. And this has been shown in public health literature. The term allostatic load is used, as in the amount of tension on any person's given mind. Studies have shown that, for example, poverty exacts a significant amount of stress on an individual. Similarly, studies have also shown that racism has such an impact as well. So that's why racism is important. This brings us to the second part of the question about what measures can be taken as a nation, as a society. This is actually a multi-pronged question because there are many nations. So in regards to what can we do as a nation of the United Kingdom, first of all, I think it's to continue to raise awareness of the impact of variables such as racism. Yes, it is one variable of many, but it's a variable that for far too long has been ignored. Many groups are working closely together to continue to raise that awareness. And that awareness is important because it allows people to become more sympathetic to the plight of the marginalized. They can realize that actually it's not just in their head, not just imagining things, that these things aren't funny, that they shouldn't be, they're not something that you just joke about willy-nilly without consequence. that actually they do have a deleterious impact on people's lives. And we both know that life is not without its challenges anyway. And then you overburden someone with the additional stress of variables that are known to be damaging to the mind. So raising awareness is important because we all have something to learn about a given aspect of life, okay? We're all ignorant in some respects. So I think if we can begin by giving people the benefit of the doubt that with some measure of education and information, they may see things differently, I think that's an important first step. And it does appear to work. So if I can give the example of Grenfell, awareness of what the individuals who perished were going through, the sacrifices they had made, the efforts they had made, that garnered a lot of sympathy from the general public because people started to consider things from a perspective that perhaps they hadn't considered. Following that fire, there was a lot of unity from segments of society that are normally divided. So people may say, well, what's awareness? Why is it important? That's an example of how important awareness can be, because it can be a first step in bringing together unity. That can then lead us on to an understanding of the roots of racism. And this is a much more nuanced topic, I believe. And I think it's very much rooted in the intellect's ability and proclivity towards dividing things. We are here because our intellect has categorized things: dangerous, not dangerous, safe, not safe. Okay, so this heuristic mode of thinking, or these rules of thumb mode of thinking, has allowed the human species, the human race, to be the predominant, to be the most successful species on the planet, I suppose the top of the food chain, if you will. But this same tendency towards categorization has led us towards seeing categories in everything, even in regards to human groups and human interaction. So this is a deeper topic, and I incline to the idea that a deep understanding of the psychological roots of things such as racism, sexism, the isms, is required for each individual to then identify thinking that leads to divisiveness and then challenge it when it springs up. Because obviously the thinking leads to certain behavior, but if you can challenge it, if you can stop your thinking in its tracks, you can then start to inculcate a new pattern of behavior that is more conducive to harmony, unity, and solidarity. But again, it all boils down to education in various forms.
And according to you, is today's racism not only a matter of the color of your skin, but also a political and economical issue? What are your thoughts?
In today's society, and again I'm speaking generally, racism, yes, is an issue of color, but it's also related to politics, and it's also related to economics. And I suppose this is why people study politics, economics, and philosophy. They want to understand why humans allocate resources in the manner that they do. Because obviously, our value system is derived from an underlying philosophy, which is self-derived from certain assumptions about life. So if I were to assume that certain groups are intellectually superior and therefore are entitled to a greater amount of the Earth's resources, that will lead to an ideology and a political philosophy that leads to an implementation of those ideas. Okay? So we can see how they're all interlinked. They can't be separated. Now, if we begin with the axiom that all humans have infinite potential, that humans may begin at different levels, but with the right resources, the right ingredients, we can reach heights of attainment that perhaps are far beyond what the geniuses of our time have achieved. Then we can start to build a philosophy, an ideology, and a polity or a political structure more in line with those ideas. So we can see how the underlying philosophy and assumptions about how life should be leads to certain societal structures. So if we had this idea that we will have infinite potential, then we will build a society in line with that. It'll be far more equitable in the sense that it would give individuals the resources that they need to attain that potential, and distribution of resources would be far different. Some may argue that actually it's not about racism, it's all about economics, right? Slavery in ancient Greece was an economic necessity. That's true. But racism in ancient Greece wasn't specified as precisely along racial lines. For example, Plato, I believe, was almost sold into slavery. But in our day and age, we've taken that economics and then we've used assumptions about human beings and intellectual capacities to then decide to then build the philosophy that leads to certain economic and political structures. So it's very nuanced. PhDs can be written on this. And America at the moment is having certain discussions related to this issue. I won't go into depth into that, but I'll let people read between the lines, those who have read into it. But ultimately, we cannot assume that what we see is rooted in fact. What we see is derivative, and it's derived from certain assumptions. And if we want to create a better society, we need to challenge those assumptions. And at the moment, those assumptions are rooted in ideas, antiquated notions of race and the capacities of each race and what that means for who has the right to claim more or less of the world's resources.
John, you're also a published author. You have written 2 books. The first book that you wrote was in 2016, which was a collection of poems, which I really loved reading, Words of Feather. And you published in 2020 your second book, Excellent While You. And this book is mainly focused in helping students at school find their journey. Can you tell us a little bit more about your books? What is the key message that you are trying to convey to the audience?
Yes, I published 2 books. The first book is called Words of a Feather, The Mystical Musings of a Medical Man. And the second word is called Excellent While You. The first book is an anthology of poems, 170 poems, categorized into 4 sections: initiation, despair, hope, and light. And that book chronicles a quite interesting psychological journey that I went through in my early 20s. I've always been interested in spirituality, I suppose at a superficial level. I explored Buddhism when I was about 17 years old. But when I was in my final year of medical school, there was a lot going on in my life on a personal level. And I suppose I delved even deeper into spirituality, because I was forced to examine my ideas about life. And I began meditating quite deeply, and it led to a series of quite profound experiences and the descent of poetry into my conscious mind that was complete in its entirety and would come at will, really. the descent of poetry wasn't at my volition. So that book, what message am I trying to convey in that book? This is something that's quite personal to me, which is why poetry is such a beautiful form of art, because it allows you to embellish and cloak the personal and tailor it to those who can read and see between the lines. But the message in that is that I suppose it speaks to ontology, the science of being, what we fundamentally are. And I suppose at this stage, many people are familiar with the work of Eckhart Tolle, where he talks about, I believe he wrote a book called Stillness Speaks. And that message, the message in my book, is a message from my stillness to the stillness of others. So to put it scientifically, our model of the world, current model of the world, is based on a reductionist, materialistic philosophy. That is, if we divide things enough, we get to the atom and so on. Subatomic particles would explain how life has emerged, because apparently they're fundamental. They come first and then consciousness comes second. But actually, my experience, that of other so-called mystics, and now more recently the findings of quantum physics and what you can call the objective idealists, appears to suggest that maybe what is fundamental to the world is not matter, it may be consciousness. And I can only refer people to the works of Bernardo Kastrup, or maybe even the work of Aldous Huxley on the perennial philosophy, as well as his book The Doors of Perception. So reading it was one thing, experiencing it was another. And Carl Gustav Jung talks about this in his idea of the collective unconscious. Experiencing that was extremely powerful, and underlying the idea of something more fundamental than matter is the attributes or the qualities related to this medium that's more fundamental, this ocean of consciousness, which, without being cheesy, is love, fundamentally. And if you look at the work of the mystics, they speak about being bathed in an ocean of light and love. And this is why poetry is a beautiful medium, because it allows me to express that, or express those sentiments, without coming across as unscientific. But my more recent foray into philosophy has allowed me to put a more, I suppose, express it in a more empirical approach, objective idealism, etc., etc. And those who are interested should explore it, because it is fascinating. Once you experience it, it never leaves you. My second book was a bit more pragmatic, if you will. It was about the models that lead to academic success. I'd had many mentees who I was able to provide a model for, and I'd also helped my brothers, and I think I had this ability to create a tailored model for people. And I'd seen people go from C's and D's to A grades, and really, especially if someone has drive and determination, just providing them a model that they could then execute to achieve their academic goals was something that I wanted to put in a book. And that's why I wrote that book, really. The message in that book is really to say that, how do you achieve good grades in school? All the doctors I've spoken to, it was second nature to them. They were like, yeah, of course we knew this. But what I came to realize mentoring is that not everyone knows these things. Things that doctors and scientists and people done well in school take for granted. Not everyone might know that. So my message was that actually there is an approach that leads to better academic outcomes than you've had so far. So it was a message of hope. Don't give up, because there are always ways that you can be what you've always wanted to be.
Is there a message that you'd like to give to young people, young students who would like to go into a medical career?
I'd tell young people who want to pursue a medical career that first of all, they need to have the correct idea, or at least a very deep understanding of why they wish to pursue the medical profession. If your idea of the medical profession is based on television shows, then you may be in for a rude awakening when you begin medical school, you begin working as a doctor. I suppose people whose parents are doctors and whose family members are doctors have a more accurate idea. And it's interesting because they consider this more deeply before they pursue it. And while they may be emotionally shocked by what they experience, because obviously seeing someone else go through it is very different from experiencing it yourself, they no doubt were expecting it. So they're forewarned, if you will. And I say forewarned, not because it's something that it's frightening necessarily, but I think it's, the profession does require all of you, not just your intellect. Obviously, it's a given that you're going to have a certain ability to memorize things and process information, but it requires more than just intellectual capacity. It requires, first of all, a tremendous amount of humility, because even when you do qualify as a doctor, you're just a graduate medical student. What I'm getting at is that there's always more to learn. And humility is required to communicate compassionately with your patients, to speak to them from a position of wanting to understand them, tailor your approach to them, and help them to get better in a collaborative fashion, not just with them, but with your teams. So the first thing to do, obviously, if you wish to pursue medicine as a profession, because in becoming a medical doctor, you need to obviously undoubtedly get your grades, get some good grades, because the competition for entry is incredibly high, and so it's a given. But grades alone aren't enough. You need to demonstrate through your work experience, through your pursuit of activities, that you are interested in continuous learning, that you have humility, that you are curious about expanding your mind, and that your ultimate goal is to serve human beings, and more specifically, to serve the healthcare of human beings. So I would advise them to develop themselves holistically, to speak to people who are doctors, and to also consider if their goal is to help people, which is what people always say, which is such a trite thing to say, because many professions help people. They need to understand precisely what they mean by helping people, and they need to develop themselves along those lines long before they apply to medical school. It may very well be the case that after thorough examination, they realize that their attributes and traits are more in line with another way of providing benefit to the world at large. But that's okay. Some people enter the profession because their parents want them to. That usually backfires. Because ultimately who you are will eventually come through. But then again, being a doctor, even if it's what your parents want you to do, may very well be a part of your life journey, which again speaks to philosophy of life. Our professions are but a part of our becoming, which is far greater than, to my mind, what we can see.
Can you tell me a leadership quote that has influenced you in your life?
I'm not sure if this counts as a leadership quote. I suppose it's a life quote, a quote for life. But Les Brown, motivational speaker, wrote a book, It's Not Over Until You Win. And he talks about this a lot, it's not over until you win. And the whole title of the book is It's Not Over Until You Win, How to Become the Person You've Always Wanted to Be, no matter what the obstacle. We've all had challenges in our lives. And in the pursuit of our goals, invariably, there'll be challenges, there'll be tests, there'll be obstacles. And that quote has influenced me because it's really imbibed in me the idea that dogged determination and keeping my eye on the prize is what is important. The process will become irrelevant, or will be seen to be just a process leading to a destination when I accomplish my objective. I don't see win necessarily in the sense of beating other people, but in the sense of accomplishing my objective. That quote reminds me that come what may, I must persevere. That it's not over until I reach the mountaintop. And that quote and speeches related to it by Les Brown and other speakers have really helped me to persevere against tremendous odds, to just grit my teeth and keep going. And it is true, because you look at these things in hindsight and you realize that so much learning was extracted in the process of pursuing your dream that it was all worthwhile. So yeah, that's influenced me tremendously. It's not over until you win.